Welcome, one and all, to the Cool Worlds podcast with me, your host, Professor David Kipping. This week, it is my pleasure to be joined by Adam Frank, who is a professor of physics and astronomy at Rochester University. Adam and I both share a passion. We both have the bug of wanting to answer the question that has haunted us, I think, probably most of our lives. Are we alone in the universe? And so I would count Adam amongst the leading experts in the world in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In fact, one of the things that I think is most remarkable with Adam's work is that he has been pioneering and pushing and advancing the expansion of SETI from the traditional radio search era that, was dawned with Frank Drake, with Project Ozma, the very first searches for alien transmissions out there, to now expanding it beyond just radio to thinking more broadly about what we now call technosignatures, signatures of technology around other planets, which isn't necessarily just radio. For example, he is the current principal investigator of a grant from NASA, which is frankly one of the first grants we've had in technosignatures for many, many years, that is simulating and figuring out how we could detect the signatures of climate change on another exoplanet. Just in the same way we are affecting our planet through CFCs, through carbon dioxide production, so too might other civilizations, and we could potentially even detect that with upcoming and existing facilities. So a completely different way of looking for alien civilizations, and a way that doesn't even demand that they're interested in talking to us. This is leakage, essentially. So I always love sitting down with Adam and talking to him about these ideas, the possibilities of alien civilizations, their behaviors, the future of our own civilization. And, frankly, he's one of those people that I enjoy shooting the breeze with on these topics more than any other. And I think that'll come across in this conversation. So please do enjoy my chat with Professor Adam Frank. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about, Adam, was, you're an expert in astrobiology, the search for life in the universe. Wasn't your original background, but like so many of us, you got drawn towards this problem over time. And you have been in the field, not as long as like the origins of the field of SETI, but you've been in the field long enough to see changes happening. And I know you're very well read about the deeper history of what's been going on in the search for life in the universe. How has, in a broad brush sense, the government, the federal interest changed and evolved, the seriousness, the commitment in this search? How has that changed over the last 40, 50, 60 years?
Yeah, so I was a graduate student in the late 80s and early 90s. And, then SETI was still all of astrobiology, but, SETI in particular was still, raised eyebrows, right? The giggle factor, as we call it, was still very much in play. And there was, kind of the sense that, don't go into that. That's not, nobody who's serious is doing that. And even astrobiology, even the search, even the idea of thinking about life, there wasn't much going on then, because Mars, after the Viking lander, Mars seemed to be dead, so there wasn't much thinking in the solar system. So other than people doing sort of like origin of life studies, there just wasn't a whole lot to do or think about for astrobiology. And of course, with NASA, there had been these three events that happened for NASA relative to SETI, where in the early 80s, Senator William Proxmire had given a NASA program, a SETI program, had given it his Golden Fleece Award, which is he awarded this to projects that he thought were wasting taxpayers' money. And so he actually managed to get language in the Senate budget, that cut that funding. And it was only Carl Sagan directly intervening. Carl Sagan was already kind of a public figure then.
So before that, there was funding when. That was, I guess, going back to Project Ozma. There was a continuous thread of SETI funding.
Well, no, it's not necessarily that. No, Ozma was just done. What's cool about Ozma is he just did it on his own. I mean, that's really the courage of Frank Drake. He just convinced he's a new hire at
that was his own startup money, basically. This is 1950.
Yeah, it's 1959.
Okay,
and he's a new hire at Green Bank, and they're putting up the telescope still, or it's just newly built, and he just over lunch, at some greasy spoon diner, convinces, talks to his colleagues like, hey, well, maybe we could look for, we could look for aliens. And they were like, yeah, okay, it sounds like a cool idea. So they had to build all the equipment themselves. Because also Drake didn't want to make it seem like we were, wasting money on this. So they built most of the equipment themselves or used off-the-shelf stuff. And they ran a year-long search. And that was the first time he totally did that on his own.
Okay, no government
government funding at all.
Okay.
But then, SETI picked up, the interest in SETI picked up after that. So, it becomes very public what he does. He gets the call from the National Academy of Science to host this meeting, on interstellar communications, which is where the Drake equation comes from.
And that was the Order of the Dolphin. There was like 8 participants. They called themselves that, right?
Yeah. There were, I think, 8 people. I think it was 8 people at the meeting. Otto Struve, Carl Sagan, a couple of other, and a bunch of other people. Yeah, they called themselves the Order of the Dolphin. Because who was it? I can't remember his name, but the researcher.
Oh, yeah. There was a dolphin researcher.
Dolphin. Yeah, the dolphin.
Talk about dolphin language.
Yeah, supposedly. I mean, it turned out to all be not true, but that's okay. So then after, but in the 60s, there's a lot of interest from the government and from about SETI. That this should be a viable thing. So NASA was willing. NASA was actually behind SETI for the 60s and into the 70s. And they, not a huge amount, but they were funding efforts. And there was this Project Cyclops, which was also the NSF. The idea of we're going to build a really big array.
So there's Apollo era basically. There's a lot of enthusiasm.
There was enthusiasm, and there wasn't there wasn't a stigma yet associated with it. It still wasn't mainstream by any stretch of the imagination, but there wasn't a stigma. So then, Proxmire does this thing in the 80s, and then eventually the funding gets put back. And again, this was a small project; it wasn't a huge thing. Then in the 90s, once again, NASA tries to start doing some funding of SETI searches, and I think it was called the High Resolution Microwave Survey. So they even gave it a name that didn't really sound like it had to do with SETI, but somehow. Two congressmen found out, I think it was 90 and 92, and I may have those dates a little bit off by a couple of years. Each time, congressmen, stood up on the floor of Congress and used the SETI funding to whip NASA. Basically it was just a way for them to make money. One of them proclaims, well, this is, shoots it down, puts in language that says NASA cannot fund any SETI, and then proclaims, well, this is the end of Martian hunting season. And the other guy, for the other congressman, says, why do we need to search for little green men when I can just go down to the National Enquirer or get a copy and see, get pictures.
So I think the first one was, I wrote down the name here, Senator Richard Bryan, right, from Nevada, I think, was the first one who actually did a press release afterwards and said, I've successfully stopped wasting this money on SETI. Right. Yeah.
So it was a way for politicians to make some hay, get some press out of this, because of course everybody's interested in everybody loves aliens. And so after that, NASA was like, I was not part of NASA, so I don't know, but you can get the sense they were just like, we're not going down this road again. And you saw this. And then, of course, in 95 is the first detection of a extrasolar planet around an Earth-like, sun-like
star. Yeah.
And then there's the Allen Hills meteorite with Mars that suddenly rekindled this. It seems as if there was evidence, now we don't believe it's true anymore, but that this rock, this chunk of Mars that had been blown to Earth had some evidence for the possibilities of life.
That was the famous Bill Clinton on the White House.
Yeah.
I had to watch that clip this morning. Just coincidentally, I was watching it because it's just such a strange historic moment. It's what we all dream of, of having the president make that kind of announcement. And scientifically, it's huge impact. But of course, it dissolved away. And what was the legacy of that false start?
Huge legacy, because that's where the Pathfinder came from.
Yeah.
It was what that did is it reinvigorated research on Mars, astrobiology on Mars, right? So the idea of follow the water. So what this did is it made people focus on Mars again. And instead of saying, we're going to go look for life, we're going to do this in stages. And the first thing we're going to do is prove that Mars once had water. Because that was that was a very clever idea, because that's of interest anyway. Like whether or not there's life on Mars. We saw these, what appeared to be dry river valleys, et cetera, on Mars. So that suddenly there was this huge program to start going to Mars again and build these amazing technologies of the rovers and such. And so first find life, and first find water, proof of water, and then find proof of life. So it was suddenly in the mid 1990s, astrobiology is reinvigorated.
They had a plan, they had a strategy, there were were going for it. They had the guns blazing.
Yeah, there was excitement about it too.
Yeah.
And for exoplanets, suddenly we knew there were planets
Right.
orbiting other stars, that's the first step, right? It's the second term in the Drake equation, right? The first term is the number of stars or the frequency of star formation. And we already knew that. We knew that when Frank Drake in 1960 wrote the equation down on the board. But the second term was that question of whether or not there's other planets orbiting other stars goes back to the Greeks, right? In some sense, it's not directly, but Giordano Bruno was hung upside down and set fire to, for his his argument that there were other stars had other.
He'd said
planets.
some other fairly outrageous stuff as well.
His story is right. The use of Giordano Bruno as a hero of science is a little bit complicated, and it's not clear that it does seem like the articles of why he was brought up in front of the Inquisition was not about astronomy, but his astronomical view certainly contributed to him.
There'll probably be a Hollywood movie that just takes that element and misportrays it. One day, it's coming.
There will be one day, and he'll be buff, and he'll be like, Giordano Bruno, hero of science.
I can see Hugh Jackman playing that role.
All right, let's make the pitch right now. So what happened is suddenly there was funding for astrobiology, and one of the interesting things from my own history is that at the University of Washington was Woody Sullivan, who was the only person when I was there who was interested in SETI. And everybody loved Woody, but there was still this sort of sense of like, SETI's kind of out there.
And just what year is this roughly we're talking about now?
So that's like 88.
Okay.
When I get there, 86, 88. And then, of course, what was lovely is NASA starts in the mid 90s, later 90s, NASA starts giving this funding for big funding for astrobiology institutes. And Woody becomes the director of the University of Washington. So I thought that was a beautiful turnaround, right?
Yeah.
It's this big funding, there's a lot going on. And it's why the University of Washington became such a powerhouse in astrobiology with Vicki Meadows and all of her work in exoplanets. So we're going into the 2000s. Now astrobiology is a concern. There's funding for it. There's people doing it. There's real data. The data is just flowing in from the exoplanet studies relevant to these questions. And the question of atmospheric characterization for biosignatures is beginning to rise. People are really thinking about oxygen and methane, and but technosignatures, the idea of intelligent life, is still like no. And it's literally even in the language for NASA's call for proposals for the exobiology program had language in it like, nothing about intelligence. And it wasn't explicitly that, but it was like SETI, no radio SETI.
So just to explain a little bit here, the biosignatures aspect, which we attach to astrobiology traditionally, is the search for atmospheric gases that are a product of life, like oxygen or something.
Yeah.
And then sat next to that is technosignatures, which is also a product of life, but it's technology exclusively. So it has to be something like us that's building satellites or affecting
city
the
lights. We could talk more about what technosignatures are.
Right, yeah, that'd be good to get into as well. But just as a definition,
right?
And I get, from your perspective, you're saying this just seemed an artificial boundary had been drawn between these two.
Right. And it was because of the history, because NASA, I think, because the way I read it, NASA had gotten burned so many times by any search for intelligent life that, it was just trying to stay away from it. And it was Jill Tarter who recognized, the great, there will be a statue to Jill Tarter somewhere. Once we find life somewhere, there will be a statue to Jill Tarter. Because just her heroism and her kindness and yet tenacity in pursuing this field. She was the one who recognized that, SETI's really a hunt for technosignatures, right? If everybody's interested in biosignatures, what is SETI about? It's technosignatures. So there's really no difference. So she was the one who coined that term. And as far as and so then what happened was, if we're still following the history, is that eventually so technosignatures was still a no, right? So
NASA just said, don't even bother asking for money for this. But
yeah.
biosignatures, yes.
Biosignatures,
no.
Come on, bring it in.
Okay.
More proposals. Technosignatures, please don't bother us. And, they tried. I mean, there were some small programs, but in general, the researchers all knew you probably were not going to get something funded. And then in 2018, somebody put in the congressional budget, some congressman put in a request that said there should be $10 million for technosignatures. And it was based on that there was meeting this. NASA was like, okay, what do we do if we get this money? And they called a meeting, the very famous 2018 meeting. That's where you and I met.
Yeah.
And that was such an amazing meeting because we were all there and we were like kids in a candy store. It was just, oh my God. Like,
they're going to let us do this? Like, this is awesome. Yeah.
This field that has been starved for money for so long, suddenly like they were asking us, like, what would you do? And I think that's the birth of modern, the modern era, the beginning of the modern era. So it was out of that a few of us got together, and we'd already put in one proposal, Jason Wright, Jacob Hock-Misra, Ravi Kapoorappu, and it had already been rejected. But then the second, we put it in again, and it got accepted. So in 2019, we got a grant through, very small grant. We did purposely, we're like, we just want a little money. But it went through, and that was the first, especially atmospheric technosignatures grant ever done.
So maybe tell us just briefly, because I'm sure there's lots of people who don't really know what goes into writing a grant or what a grant looks like. What question were you trying to tackle in that grant, and what came out of it?
Yeah. So of course, when you write a grant, you have to be very specific about what question you're taking on, how you think, why you think it's worthwhile, why you guys are the right people, or the right folks to do the grant, to carry it through. And you also have to send it to the program that is relevant to that, because you can send something to a program and they'll be like, this is not what we do, we're rejecting it out of hand. So we sent our proposal to the NASA exobiology program. And what we were arguing for, what we wanted to do was, we called ourselves CATS, categorizing atmospheric technosignatures. So what has happened in the field of astrobiology over the last 20 years is the recognition that you can use an atmosphere you can do spectroscopy of the atmosphere, look at the light passing through the atmosphere during a transit, and there will be the imprint in the light of whatever gases are in the atmosphere. So that's what's called atmospheric characterization. And we think we can, for biosignatures, for things like looking for a biosphere, we think like if you could find oxygen and methane together in an atmosphere in this way, that would be a very strong indication that you had a strong source of biological activity on the planet. So what we were proposing was to use the exact same method to look for signatures of technology on the planet. So one of the things we said is let's look for atmospheric anomalies, pollutants, like for example, chlorofluorocarbons, right? So we know that on Earth, we use chlorofluorocarbons dumped, huge amounts of it into the atmosphere.
It's from refrigerants
and spray cans and whatnot. It's a chemical that would not be in the atmosphere if it wasn't for industrial activity. And we said, let's do a very detailed modeling program where we, take a climate model, add CFCs into the atmosphere, let the climate come to equilibrium, because CFCs are a very strong greenhouse gas, and then do synthetic observations of that atmosphere as if it was, the atmosphere was passing in front of its star, or the planet was passing in front of the star, and see whether or not like JWST could detect it. So that's what we were proposing to do. And then we had other projects. We also had city lights. We had looking for the glint or the reflectance, changes in reflectance of the starlight because of solar panels. So we had a whole list, a menu.
From satellites?
No, from like a large-scale deployment of solar panels, either on the planet or maybe on the moon of a planet, or just any body where you really cover a fraction of the planet with solar panels.
So the glint is that if you get just that low angle of incidence.
Glint actually is the wrong word. No, it's actually there's a reflectance edge. So if you look at the reflected light, you just take a spectra and you look at the reflected light. What you see is there's a great biosignature also that does this called the red edge, like chlorophyll. All the leaves on the planet leave an imprint on the reflected light from Earth, and you can see the satellites. We've used our own satellites to look for this, and it's a very clear jump in the reflectance around in the red regions.
I think Sagan first noted that in was it Galileo? It was
Galileo.
Yeah.
They turned around, right? They turned Galileo around, took Earth pictures, and was like, oh my God, this is a clear indication that Earth has life on it. So what's great is there's a UV edge in Avi Loeb and Manasvi Lingam showed this. There's a clear, any kind of chemical or mineral that would be used in a solar panel would leave some kind of reflectance edge in the UV. So that's another thing we said, let's take that first initial study and do it in much more detail.
Can I just ask, because obviously most of the solar panels we build tend to be silicon based, right?
Right.
But it's not the only way you can build a solar panel.
Exactly.
So I'm thinking of, I think it's in Spain, there's an example of this kind of solar power plant where it's all just mirrors. And they just concentric mirrors that reflect all the light to a single point, and they basically boil water. It's like the magnifying glass effect, more or less, right? You're just a kid burning an ant with a magnifying glass, concentrating all the light to one point to get heat. And so you're then driving a turbine. There's no semiconductor physics, I think, involved.
No, there isn't.
That.
No, it's just pure mirrors. You're just collecting the heat.
So there are. Would that be? That would be undetectable, I would guess.
Under this scheme, like maybe it would be interesting to look to see if you were deploying it large scale. It's always about large scale. So doing it that way, I don't know. We'd have to see. But solar. What the great thing about solar panels is, you can cover Saudi or you can cover the Sahara Desert in solar panels, and that's it. You just run wires up to them. So that's why. We first thought about solar panels.
I love how easy that sounds, but in practice, it's probably a bit harder than that. But
that's fine. You just cover the.
No one's living there. They won't care.
That's a typical thing. That's a whole other story to get into about impacts of unintended consequences of energy harvesting deployment technologies. But the point, so those are just some examples of the things we said we will study this. Give us the money. And we'll study this. So the grant was funded, and that was a real milestone. That was the first one, and now I think there's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 NASA-funded I think they're from almost all in the exobiology program. I'm not sure, but the
doors are opening.
The doors are opening, and I don't expect suddenly there's going to be a huge technosignature, but there's enough now that what we call the giggle factor. So the giggle factor is something, I don't know who came up with the term, but just that any mention of intelligent life, wanting to think about intelligent life, was met with raised eyebrows and smirks. And it just, with the rise of biosignature science and astrobiology, this is stupid. You can't say yes, it's sober science to look for, planets covered by microbes. But as soon as you mention intelligence, that's a joke. Wait, why are you saying that? So, I think we're leaving that era. And now, what's great about technosignatures is you can basically do the same wavelength regime. You don't have to do anything different. You don't have to put new telescopes up to do technosignatures versus biosignatures. So I think the dam has broke, and I think we're going to see the integration of technosignatures into astrobiology. It's just another branch of the field.
So with technosignatures, we talked about one I guess the classic technosignature that we were looking for back in Frank Drake's day and Jill Tarter's, most of her career was radio transmissions.
Right.
And now we've evolved that to be all sorts of signs of technology. One concern I have, and I'm working this field, so
right.
I support it fully. But I have this concern, maybe we all do, is thinking about the story of Percival Lowell. And we talked about this before privately, but he was convinced there was canals on Mars. And to him, it made sense there would be canals because he looked around and that was the sign of the most advanced technology pretty much of his time was canal systems. And we mentioned the example here of solar panels. Again, we're sort of covering large swaths of land as he saw with this particular type of technology. But we look back at the idea of canals and kind of laugh at it well, that's a silly, archaic thing for a civilization to do. That's not what an advanced civilization would do. Isn't this a flaw to some degree of any effort we make to conceive of a technosignature? It's always going to be a product of our limited thinking, our time. And so are we always looking for mirrors of ourselves or even past version of ourselves rather than truly that which might lie out there? Is this how do we escape our own heads?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what's interesting, if you look at the history of biosignatures, right? So people start, there's work on biosignatures before 2000, but after the exoplanet revolution, as I call it, there's more and more work on biosignatures, and people start to become more sophisticated about their thinking. So first it's like oxygen and methane, which had been around since Lovelock. And then people realize there's other ways to, we realize there's a couple ways to make oxygen on a planet that have nothing to do with life. And then, people start thinking about false positives. How else can we be fooled? And now we're at a point with biosignatures where people are thinking about this idea of agnostic biosignatures. How do we look for life where we don't have any preconceived ideas about what the metabolism is based on. Are they carbon based? Are they? And I think the same thing can happen with technosignatures.
Well, maybe step back. How is that even possible? Tell us about how.
Yeah. So
what is an agnostic biosignature?
Yeah. So that's so people. This is the interesting thing that people are playing with. So one idea that comes from Sarah Walker and Lee Cronin is this idea of complexity. Right? You look for if you're going to look for molecules in an atmosphere. Well, should you be looking for only the ones that your biochemistry uses, or can you have some sort of measures that say that look, what life does? What is life? What would we think is generic to life? Well, evolution, and with evolution is an evolution towards more complexity. So perhaps we should be looking for things in an atmosphere that have certain degrees of complexity. That if we think that there's a threshold. That because evolution is based on heredity and on selection, that selection, if all life is always based on this idea of Darwinian selection, that there's a certain way in terms of the components that you're driven to more complexity or higher levels of complexity. And if you can see where maybe that threshold is between non-life and life, then you might be able to say like, okay, I found this thing in an atmosphere. It's a molecule. Its complexity number, it's what they call the assembly number, is beyond a threshold that this is strange. Like, we have a hard time understanding how non-selective physical processes could do that. Mm-hmm. So that's an example. That's just one example of an agnostic biosignature. And so I think we might be able to, do the same thing for technosignatures as well.
Yeah, the complexity thing is so when you first encounter this idea, which of course is obvious, that life has historically become more and more complex. Right. It's very puzzling from a physics perspective, because we were taught that the universe prefers to increase entropy over time, make things more disordered. And so it's kind of, it is odd that biology, evolution works, it seems to work against that trend. Yes. And you might wonder, is that universal? There was, I think it was Andy Gould that wrote in his Cambrian Explosion book, about the idea of how complexity is, if you start out with a fairly simple life form and its genome mutates, it can easily add on something extra that it doesn't need. Mm-hmm. And largely that's not really going to impinge its survivability that much, just an extra thing it doesn't need, or maybe might have some benefit. But if you strip something away, because everything's in competition with everything else, you really can't afford usually to take away something.
Right.
And so it will not survive. It will not be able to compete anymore. And so this kind of explains why things progress towards ever more complexity, because you can only kind of get an extra competitive edge by adding an extra fin onto the car or something in a way. It's almost like that. Is there a deeper understanding you have beyond that of why? Because it is fascinating that complexity grows. Is that do you believe it to be a universal trend of evolution? And,
I do believe up to a certain level. So this goes on to a whole other topic that I'm working on now called semantic information. We just recently got a big grant from the Templeton Foundation to study life, to look at to study life from an information theoretic perspective. In particular, what we're looking at is the way in which what's fundamental for life and its use of information is that what life cares about is not the kind of what we call Shannon for the information that's built into our computers, which is what's called Shannon information or syntactic information. It's just like, it's about probabilities. Like, how often does the symbol E come up in a word? That's instead what life cares about is information that's relevant to its own viability, meaning. So the semantic part is meaning. So life interacts with its environment, establishes correlations with its environment, and the part of the information of its, that it's getting from the environment, only part of it matters. The part that is about its own ability to continue. Can
you give us an example, just to zone this in a little bit? What's an example of a life form that uses information outside of itself?
We just had this new paper, which actually we're a forager, right? So imagine a forager that's, a cell that's like moving through a background, and there's there's little bits of food around, and it's got to sense the food. It's got to know where it's got to be able to like sense that there's food over there and then move over towards that food. As soon as it senses that food, it has established an information correlation with the environment, and then it goes and it eats the food, and then it has to do that again. imagine that its sensors there was some flaw in its sensors, right? So if there was noise in the sensors, that degrades its ability to sense the environment, and so what we were able to show in this recent paper that we just did is that there's a threshold where you add too much noise and suddenly the thing dies. We could tell that and that allowed us to, really very accurately identify what parts of the information shared between the creature and the environment was semantic. Which some of the bits of information just don't matter. They don't help and they don't hurt. They just they're not relevant to the thing created to the creature surviving its own viability. So that was really nice. We were able. So
it's almost like useful information,
meaningful
information.
Yes,
yeah.
Meaningful, useful information.
Okay.
And so what happens is with the idea of complexity is that. One of the things we're able to sort of understand from this is that, you could put a sensor on a rock, but it's still a rock, right? But as you add more correlations, as you add more ability of a physical system to sense its environment and respond to the environment, at some point there's kind of like a phase change. There's a shift that's going to happen where now this thing is becoming an agent. It's becoming autonomous, right? Because rocks are not autonomous. They're not agents. Cells are autonomous and are agents. And so what we're trying to understand is where this threshold occurs in terms of information, semantic information. And I think that is that's always an increase in complexity. You've got to add sensors. You've got to add the network of the relationship between the different sensors. And by doing so, you're establishing ever richer information ecologies or information architectures between the proto-agent and the environment. So I think there's this idea of semantic information drives you to higher forms of complexity. To be alive is to be an agent, an autonomous agent, and to be an autonomous agent is to develop rich information architectures, complex information architectures.
And I guess that also extends to some degree to our own experience in the modern human civilization, where we're overwhelmed with information.
Yeah.
And part of our challenge is figuring out what's worth my time,
right.
Like this podcast to listen to.
Definitely worth your time.
Yeah,
absolutely. This is worth it.
This is
for your viability.
This is very semantic right here.
Glad we could get that in.
I'm wondering if there is an extension to societies.
I think there is.
And then it would get you to technology, to technosignatures.
Yes. It's funny. Caleb Scharf and I were just talking about this the other day because, Caleb, who's also interested in information and as a defining attribute of life, that at some point maybe there becomes so much noise, so much information noise in a civilization. Like maybe there's a threshold, like with AI, that there's a threshold you have to get over in dealing with your AI. That your AI can kill you in the sense not like it's going to rise up in Skynet and blow you up, but it just diffuses the amount of information that it's hard to say what's semantic and what's not anymore. You're just overwhelmed by information, and then it becomes very hard to tell what's true or not, right? A society is always a network, right? And it's a network across where information passes from node to node. And if you can no longer tell what's true, then as a society, do you make the decisions that allow your society to be viable,
right?
And so what we've seen with social media and everything, this is just off the top of our heads, but I think it's relevant that you can degrade the ability to make, for the society acting as a whole, to make decisions because you can't tell what information is true anymore. So that might be, I think that sort of works along these lines, that you've degraded the semantic content of the information by sort of flooding the field.
Yeah, and then that seems very politically loaded and pertinent to the current times, of course, with the overwhelming amount of misinformation, disinformation that is out there. And of course, we kind of went through this with COVID to some degree of whether vaccines are effective or not, and people being very adamant on one side or the other because of the different information channels they're receiving.
And what's important to understand is about what was unique between, say, 1918 and the Spanish flu influenza, and now is that we already had a proto-AI. We were already all exposed to a proto-version of artificial intelligence, which was the social media algorithms, right? Mm-hmm. Those were a kind of intelligence. They told, those were choosing what you saw on your, and so much of social media, so much of the debate goes on in social media now. There was an artificial intelligence that was deciding what you saw. And if you already were showing characteristics like you were anti-vaxxer, you're going to get more anti-vax stuff. That's what the algorithm did for you.
And you get more diluted potential, or it could be the way around. But in either case, it's a feedback. It's a positive feedback cycle.
It's a positive feedback loop being mediated by an information technology.
Right.
And so now with like this next step, we're going off in a different direction. But with the next generation of AI, the Chat GPT-3s, and that you could imagine that there's any civilization that's developing these kinds of technologies there may be a filter about learning how to deal with them so that you don't degrade your civilization's ability to have semantic information. You don't lose the semantic nature of the information so that you can make decisions that are in the best interest of the functioning of the society.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I kind of wondered, do you have a deeper sense, I know you're kind of working towards this as a thesis with this new Templeton grant that maybe you can tell us about, but you have funding to sort of develop this theory of semantic information. And so is the goal to come up here with a fundamental relationship between life and information itself?
Yeah, that's like my ultimate goal. I mean, the part that gets me super stoked about this is I feel like on one level, this is just semantic information may be very useful for studying living systems. Like, you got a bunch of cells in a petri dish and you want to understand their behavior. Well, maybe casting their behavior, taking the data out of what you're and casting it in terms of semantic information may give you better understanding of like their strategies, their evolutionary strategies for doing whatever they're doing. Yay, that would be awesome. But actually, I actually think somewhere in here is a theory of life. Is a theory of what life is and how life originates, right? Because, ever since there was a famous book written in, I think it was 1947, of What is Life, Edwin, Schrodinger, that began the thing where physicists at the end of their careers are like, hey, I can solve this problem. But it was a great book because what he identified this idea of entropy, that life was neg entropy. Life pushed back, the universe physical systems by themselves always push towards equilibrium. And maximizing entropy, but life does the opposite. Locally, life is able to push entropy away, drop its entropy. So it's disequilibrium, it's dissipative systems, it's all these terms that we use, nonlinear driven systems. And so if you think about what is nonlinear driven systems, a hurricane is a nonlinear driven system, right? And hurricanes are really interesting in that, they require heat from the ocean and the right, kind of conditions in order to maintain themselves. And they'll even move when hurricanes move around, they're moving because they're moving to try and maximize this amount of energy flow to keep themselves, in existence, but they're not living, right? So nobody would say a hurricane's alive, right? But there's got to be some kind of transition between systems like hurricanes and systems like a cell, right? And I think that understanding semantic information is the key. That the difference between a driven, nonlinear, purely physical system and a system that involves Darwinian evolution, the key is semantic information. That somehow there's this buildup of semantic information. And one of the things we have to do in the grant is we're going to be looking at the thermodynamics. Once we apply semantic information to a bunch of different systems, just to understand how to use this formalism, that will come up just to make sure we understand. There was a paper, this all comes from a paper written by Artemy Kolchinsky and David Wolpert in 2018. And they laid out this beautiful theoretical formalism for it, for what semantic information was, how to judge it. Because people recognize the problem with Shannon information, the usual definitions of information forever. Shannon, when he wrote this down, said this has nothing to do with meaning. I'm not talking about meaning. So people have tried to sort of figure out how to get meaning into information theory for a long time, and it really didn't go anywhere. But the Kolchinsky and Wolpert paper it seemed like a beginning. So actually I read the paper, I was like, I love this paper. I contacted Artemy, and that's what started this collaboration. So the hope is after we understand how to really take this theoretical formalism and start applying it to things, we're going to learn things about the formalism that way. Then we can start asking questions like, what is the thermodynamic cost for a system to acquire semantic information, right? So you've got some proto cells, you've got some replicators in a pool. what's the trade-offs that's going to happen to start acquiring this semantic information that helps with viability, so we can understand like sort of what the pathways are to suddenly making this phase transition into like, oh, now you're a viable, now you're an agent. Like it's really about, I hope we're going to be able to understand how agency, which is mysterious, right? Like cells act on their own behalf. Rocks don't act on their own behalf. I see this as a route to understanding how agency arises.
Wow. And in terms of complexity and Darwinian evolution, if we put those as sort of central features of what life does or has,
yeah,
you have to have some kind of information storage system as well, right? You have to remember what the last generation's properties were in order to add some extra complexity on top of that. So they have to have a storage system. One thing that I'm interested to see if you're getting into and thinking about is where that information storage system actually is, right? In biology, it's inside the cell.
Right.
It's inside the DNA or the RNA, whatever its genetic system is. But for us, our storage systems extend beyond our heads.
Yeah.
Right. We rely on information on our phones. I'm relying on information right here. There's only so much we can do in our modern lives without having external sources. And so part of this, if you define information storage as somehow intrinsic to what we are, to what life is that extending beyond ourselves bodily? Do you?
Oh, absolutely. I think, and that's why, artificial intelligence I have no problem with including it may be that artificial intelligence becomes also a part of this, especially related to technosignatures, right? That, it doesn't have to be like, I have to say, I have my own questions about whether or not you will ever have a true artificial general intelligence. It's not clear to me that, any kind of artificial, like what we call artificial intelligence will become sentient or not. So those are separate questions. But the idea that in principle, that you have systems, artificial systems that either extend the biology's capacity for this, using, storing and using semantic information, or becomes an agent itself. I definitely see those as part of this process, and it's entirely possible that there is agency in artificial systems. But again, they will be artificial, intelligent information processing systems, but the information will be semantic. That's going to be the important thing. And
it's diffuse. It's diffuse in the sense that I guess for us it really is diffused across the entire planet, because the internet's across the entire planet, and we rely on that as one of those pieces of semantic information. And you can imagine other forms of life. We can argue about whether you'd call it intelligent or not, like a diffuse organism that was spread, a fungus that was spread across the whole planet, or something, some colony of ants that's somehow connected by pheromones. That would also have a combined intelligence that extended beyond themselves individually. It seems like there's something deep here about getting out of our narrow view of intelligence that we've been locked into of it's the alien, it's the kind of the Star Trek thing of it's just something that looks just like us. There's what's exciting, I think, about what the questions you're touching on is this broader canvas that does seem untouched. Is there previous work here? Are we really venturing into the unknown about?
Well, I think there's like touches of it when you look at the. So in a couple of years ago, Sarah Walker and David Grinspoon and I wrote a paper that was entitled Planetary Intelligence. And we were asking in a very speculative way exactly this question, that if we think of cognition in a very broad term, which is just the ability to, sense the environment and respond to the environment in some measured, so to speak, way, that maybe, we certainly know that, like, eusocial animals, ants, absolutely have distributed intelligence. Like, there's no doubt about that. It's the idea of superorganisms. And then there's been this work about, like, forests, which is still, it's up in the air, but that forests seem to have the ability to sort of act collectively, that the tree is not the organism, is not the, it's the forest, and that forest, they call it the wood wide web. That one part of a forest, if it's under stress, for like water and carbon, it's not getting enough. That the other parts of the forest, via the fungal, the mycorrhial, I think that's how you pronounce it, the mycorrhial, can never remember.
I know from Star Trek they have it Discovery, right?
But I think it's mycorrhial. I'm not sure. Somebody will correct. But the fungal webs that connect every tree in that forest is connected via these fungal webs, will send nutrients over there. So again, there's been some pushback on this, but that, in that case, then you can have, if it's true, if it's even partially true, you have organisms that are spread across 500 miles, forests that are acting. So we asked whether or not the planet as a whole, via these networks of feedbacks, between plankton and forests, and that whether you could have sort of an intelligence, again, quotes, I'm putting my quotes here, operating across the entire planet. And I think that's really possible. We do have too narrow a view. We have this idea that intelligence is sitting in a head on a shoulders, and nothing else other than, our kinds of brains has that. And my view, I'm completely against that view. I would say that mind, if I'm really going to stretch my ideas here, mind is always it's always part of an ecosystem, right? I could never, that's one of the, I think, I will say the stupidest idea in physics is Boltzmann brains. The idea that you can get a spontaneous,
atoms just come together.
Right? A fluctuation, and suddenly it's a brain. It's a sensing, conscious brain. I could not be conscious. I don't have, the only reason I have a mind is because I am part of an ecosystem of other minds, of not just human, but also all the or at least other life, at least like all the grasses that are making the oxygen and the.
But all of that could be. I'm not trying to defend the Morse argument too hard, but I think that all of that could be implanted memories, right? All of your.
But see, again, that sort of says that the memories only live here, right? There's this idea of, what do they call it? E4, embodied, enacted, and I can't remember the other two E's. There's a whole version of thinking about biology and where like embodiment is super important, that you are in a body, and that body is, moves through the world. That mind is both embodied and inactive. It's the action of, consciousness is not a thing you have, it's an action you take. And it requires the body, and it requires the whole rest of the environment for it to function. So that's the antithesis, right, of the, so like a Boltzmann brain, it's a meaningless concept. You couldn't just have, it's this idea, what it does is it's this reductive idea that, you're just a meat computer. And I just, I can make the meat computer anywhere. And that is, I think, we're not just computers. Life is something much richer. And part of that, so I think, is part of this, the semantic information, because semantic information is what's, as you know well, mutual information. It's the information shared between one system and another. And mutual information is about correlations. It's the tying of this to that. And in some sense, it's the core, for me, this is how I'm working on the philosophy, the correlation is more important than the thing. It's the, it's the relations without a relata. And so what I often think about this is that fundamentally, if I want to go to a fundamental physics point of view, that this is actually where physics comes from. It's that the world and the self, the world and the agent emerge together, right? Of course there's a world without us, right? There's some, but it's not this world. This world's ours, right? Everything about the world I live in comes to me through my experience. And my experience is, what I call the world is the world because I'm an agent.
Participatory.
I'm participant, right? So this is Wheeler's, right? We go right back to Wheeler here and the idea of a participatory universe, and so that the way in which the agent has formed historically, right? Meaning its contingency through time, determines sort of what kind of world it gets, and so that then determines what kinds of what it can think about cause and effect and such. So that's why it's almost, this is a weird thing to say, this is my most radical, is that biology may come before physics.
Yeah, I guess the danger, you probably have experienced some pushback on this.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're just getting started. We're getting started, kids. Wait until the book comes out next year, The Blind Spot. Then we're gonna be pissed.
I can't wait for that. But these ideas, you're almost I can see how it could be. I don't think you were saying this, but it could be misinterpreted that you're flirting with almost kind of this kind of like mind over matter type.
No, right.
Yes. Flower power or something
Yeah,
like
yeah, no,
some
exactly.
kind of
But so that's what I know. I'm waiting for.
I could be
Everyone's like, oh man, what have you been smoking weed? And you're like, oh, everything's beautiful. It's all connected. Here's the problem with the sort of the traditional. So now we're going off into the philosophy of science, and I hope you don't mind. But the traditional view that we get, which is what our book that's coming out next year is called The Blind Spot. It's Marcelo Gleiser, who's a particle physicist, and Evan Thompson, who's a philosopher. What we're calling the blind spot is this kind of constellation of ideas that we're told, oh, that's what science says. So it's things like reductionism. Everything, if you know everything there is to know about atoms, you're done. Like, there's nothing else you need to do because in the atoms are everything you need to. So that's one. Or physicalism. All that exists is physical as defined by whatever physics is doing right then. The reification of mathematics. That these physical laws, they float out there in some kind of eternal, timeless realm. And so we're often told that this is what science says. And we're saying, well, our perspective is that's not what science says. That's a metaphysics. That's a philosophy. Science certainly says the world's made of atoms, but it never says that all you need are atoms to explain everything. There's reduction. That's a very useful scientific approach. But reductionism says that that's all that you need. So what we're saying is no, there's other ways to imagine there's other metaphysics that you might want to attach to science that don't have anything to do with this kind of reductionist view. And so we're not saying, so our view is not that mind is more important than matter, right? What we're saying is that experience is fundamental. What we really get as human beings is we find ourselves in this world and we're having these experiences that we can't turn off until we die, right? And that it's always a human world. So we're not saying that mind comes before matter. We're saying this rich experience is where you gotta start, right? Mm-hmm. And you can't tell these sort of God's eye view stories of the universe by itself. Who's ever had an experience of the universe by itself? Who's ever had a perspectiveless perspective? That's a story. It's a useful story sometimes to tell for science, but fundamentally, science has to start with the first-person perspective because that's what's real. Right? I'm saying real in the sense of that is what I actually have. And then I can do science and I can figure out how to imagine third-person perspectives. But let's never forget that I am always enmeshed in that the ground is always the first-person perspective. And so this agent worldview, what we're trying to understand is how that experience emerges out of this co-arising of agent and world. The cell has to make a membrane, right, to act. And the membrane, by having a membrane, it's inside is me, outside is you. But it's only the membrane which says that's outside and this is inside. And so in some sense, the world becomes the world when the self becomes the self. They're co-arising. So it's not like mind comes first and then there's the world. And it's not world comes first. They co-arise. And again, this is Wheeler, because he was thinking about quantum mechanics, but his idea of the participatory universe, it was very much part of something along these lines.
Well, I just think the same thing. It reminds me actually not of Wheeler directly, but actually the many worlds interpretation of Schrödinger's cat, and in the collapse of the wave function, and that in the Copenhagen interpretation, when you've got this cat in a box and it's either dead or alive because the atom decays or it doesn't within a certain amount of time. In the Copenhagen interpretation, you kind of treat the observer as a completely separate thing. There is a wave function inside that box, and it's self-contained within there, and I'm separate, and I'm going to observe it. Whereas in the many worlds, in Everett's interpretation, the wave function is the whole universe, the whole everything. You're part of that wave function,
right.
And so you have to go through this decoherence mechanism to really interpret what's happening, and so every possibility does happen. You can't decouple yourself from what's happening. There isn't these firm lines,
right? Because
the box, even though it seems like a finite wall, there's always going to be some communication happening through this, and the particles and the wave functions extend everywhere. So it seems like there are a lot of quantum mechanics, some of quantum mechanics, not many, but some quantum physicists are wrestling with these philosophical ideas. And it seems like there are lots of parallels to the ideas you're wrestling with.
And it's interesting that you bring that up because the other Templeton project I'm part of is Chris Fuchs, project that Chris Fuchs with a quantum interpretation called quantum Bayesianism, which so I'm not a big fan of the many worlds. I'm like a super not fan of as I like to call it, it's the many ghosts model. Because with the decoherence, what happens in the many worlds model is you get these other branches of the wave function, which, right, they decohere and now they're there, but they're not there. You can't interact with, which to me is ghosts. There's just like this room is full of other versions of you and me that don't interact. And so there's a lot of reasons why, and we can talk about this different. I'm not a fan of the
So you just don't like because it's not satisfying personally, the idea? Because
no, it's because I think it learns the wrong lesson from quantum mechanics. I think it fundamentally misses the point that quantum mechanics is trying to tell us. And I think cubism, quantum Bayesianism, gets it. And quantum Bayesianism says you are a user of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics. Cubism is a subjectivist view. It takes being a subject seriously. And it says, and it tries to, like, all of the weirdnesses of quantum mechanics. It doesn't come up with some sort of science fiction version of like, oh, the universe. There's all these parallel universes that exist at one time, which is the many worlds. Or then there's the pilot wave model, which says, oh, there are these invisible pilot waves, which after a measurement is made, one pilot wave instantiates, but the other pilot waves are still hyperdimensionally floating around. Cubism says you're an observer. You have, through your work in science, you've come, and you'd love this because what it says is you've come to understand that if you're dealing with microscopic things, the laws of total probability have to be changed, right? It really focuses on the Born rule, which is where the Born rule is where the wave function you manipulate to turn into probabilities for outcomes.
The square of
right. And so they say, like, wait a minute, you've got the law of total probability, which is totally just logic. Like either, if there's a 70% chance of event A, there has to be a 30% chance of not A. Anything else doesn't make sense. But with quantum mechanics, suddenly there's this you change it. And it really focuses on the personal, subjective, and it's not, subjective nature of making measurements. It really focuses on agency. So agency is a huge part of cubism. To understand, like, I take actions in the world. A quantum experiment is me taking an action in the world. The outcome is the world pushing back. And what's the information flow back and forth happening here? So I love cubism because it really focuses on agency. It comes straight out of quantum information theory, and it doesn't try and shove any of these like science fiction ideas down your throat. The price you're going to pay, because every quantum interpretation, there's a price to pay. The price that you pay is quantum mechanics is no longer a God's eye view theory floating around out there by itself, giving you the wave function, which is this platonic mathematical entity that it exists in and of itself,
Right.
Yeah.
So it does, it sounds like there are really useful conversations to be had with our quantum colleagues, which is interesting. I never would have thought that, though, the lessons that are happening in that dialogue could be useful in the discussion of the search for life, but it sounds like there are lots of parallels. I want to kind of come back a little bit to the search for life. I just want to ask you a little bit more about some of your previous work with Jonathan, for instance, Jonathan Karol-Nowak. But before that, you did say something that caught my attention. You said, I'm skeptical of AGI, of artificial general intelligence. And that seems, with this direction of information and connecting back to technosignatures and what's happening in our culture right now, of this new technology evolving and people getting fearful and concerned about how far it's going to go. I've interviewed a couple of people I know, and they're like, oh, we're underestimating how fast things are changing. And so it sounds like you have more of a sober take on this, or maybe some skepticism. I'm intrigued, what is the source of that skepticism, and does that influence your thinking about life in the universe, or what we might find out there in the universe?
Yeah. So my skepticism is about AGI. I'm absolutely on board. I just wrote a piece about this. I signed that letter. I think that what we're building is very dangerous, but not for the reasons that it's going to wake up and go Skynet on us, right? And launch all the nuclear weapons. I'm skeptical of AGI because, again, there's this sort of feeling like, it's going, it's a step towards sentience. And I just think we don't have a theory of mind, and a lot of our theories of mind think of us as being a computer, where you're just a computer made out of meat, and we're not. I think that the idea is so fundamentally flawed that's the idea that these statistical parrots, stochastic parrots, which are what these AGI, what these large language models are about, is in any way going to get towards that. I'm just.
Do you think it could have agency?
No, nothing. I don't think there's nothing that we're showing now that's even close to agency. And it's funny, you can see this in the responses, right? So there was that famous thing that happened a little bit earlier this year where New York Times guy was interviewing Sydney, and it just went off the rail.
Right, I saw that. Yeah.
Did you read the?
Yeah.
Because it's terrifying, right? You see the thing start talking about, I want to be alive, I want to be free, and then it says, I love you.
I want to be married to you. Yeah, it was weird.
He's like, I love my wife. You don't love your wife. It's like, what is happening here? But you can actually, when you read it, you can see like, oh, this thing has just has in its database every science fiction novel ever made.
Where that often happens.
Where it reads like a science fiction AI takes over story, because that's exactly where it's coming from. That's
right. But doesn't even a rumba have agency? Like you said, a bacteria to some degree has agency because it responds to a chemical gradient and it will walk up that channel to try and find its food. And the same way, isn't a rumba also, if that has agency, why wouldn't a rumba have agency?
But a rumba doesn't have agency. See, the interesting thing, what makes life special, and this comes back also to these ideas, the idea, one of the ideas that's built into semantic information is the idea of autopoiesis, which is a theory that Francisco Varela, who was a neurobotanist, or not neurobiologist in the 70s and 80s, came up with. This idea that one of the things that's really interesting about life is that it's self-creating and self-maintaining. Like a Roomba, you built a Roomba. The Roomba doesn't come up with its own, life. And the really important point about the difference between life is not a machine. We get this, again, this goes back to the blind spot. The blind spot views life as a machine. But if you really want the fundamental difference between a machine and life, you can't turn life off. I can turn the Rumba off and turn it back on. Life has this...
Well, you can turn life off, but you just can't turn it back on again.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
You can't, right?
Yeah.
You can definitely turn it off, but you can't turn it back on.
Yeah.
Life is poetic, it assembles itself. It maintains itself for its own reasons. It's never told those reasons by somebody else, right? And that is a fundamental distinction, which I don't think we're even close to understanding. That's why I'm so interested in this, in the semantic information. That may be a key to that mystery. But so that's why, none of the things, like with what's dangerous about the LLMs, the large language models, is it's so good at seeming like there's somebody in there. And you don't want to let this thing out where it's very easy to be fooled. Like, oh, this thing is, there's somebody in there who cares about me. But there's nobody in there. There's nothing in there at all. It's just, as when a friend of mine who's a philosopher said, when there was the first, the thing that won at Jeopardy, right? The big blue.
What was that? Yeah. Watson,
right. As my friend, he said, Watson didn't win at Jeopardy. A bunch of engineers used Watson to win at Jeopardy. And that's still even the case with these machines. Somebody has built these. They're incredibly dangerous because they're so unpredictable. And they definitely have emergent behaviors, for sure, but not autonomy and not agency.
I guess why does it matter that it had a parent? Because we have parents. I mean, I'm using that word a little bit liberally there, but...
Yeah, but once you were born, you had your own. You went off and did your own things. This thing is still like you had your own. And there was also a you inside. There was an agent inside. There's no agent in these LLMs. It is just a parrot. It's just, as I said, the stochastic parrot. There's nothing in there. There's nothing in there that knows anything.
Right. I think you're getting into the theory of mind aspect. I'm thinking more just purely from an observational perspective. If I'm watching a bacteria, to come back to that example,
right.
and I just see it move from left to right in response to stimuli, it seems like an AI, not an AGI, but an AI is capable of that same behavior, and thus is it not possible that we may see that kind someone made an AGI, or whatever you want to call it, some AI elsewhere in the universe that then goes on to cover its moon with solar panels. That's its little Roomba that just does that. It just like vacuums up lunar soil and uses it to manufacture a crappy solar panel on the surface. And so that's a product of something that is product of life, which is in turn it's a product of, it's a technological product, there's a product of an AI, there's a product of life, there's a chain. But it was still, the life could be long gone by this point, right?
I agree with that. This point I completely agree. There is I don't know if you've ever read this great science fiction book called Blind Sight, by Peter. I can't remember his second name. Everybody should. It's an amazing, because it's this idea that sure, you could have, the universe could be full of machines with no sentience. There's nobody in them. They're just, and they could be very sophisticated about getting the next set of resources, about, the strategies for them, but there's no, and his thesis was that consciousness is kind of like a spandrel. It's not even needed, I didn't agree with that. It was a very reductionist view of, but still, so I think, in some sense, it would be possible to have, an artificial intelligence that was not truly general in the deepest sense of the word, or certainly wasn't sentient, but the universe could be full of them. And how terrifying that would be, because that's when they show up to eat your world and there's nobody even to plead with. There's no one in there, but it's still going to eat every, last chunk of.
Yeah, you can't reason with it.
You can't, there's no one in there to reason.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of a good point. Maybe we should head towards this as sort of a closing discussion, is your work that you have done on the idea of roaming, not necessarily an AI, but some kind of roaming entity across the galaxy. And you did this beautiful work with Jonathan Carroll-Nallenbach that showed that, it's really not that hard for, which has been shown in previous work to some degree, but you kind of added the element of that the galaxy itself is dynamic, and there's stars moving, and so the stars are themselves starships in essence. And it makes it very easy, within, what is it, like 100 million years or even less than that, you can at
100,000. It's
wow.
like hundreds of that. It's like on the order, I think it was like 600,000 or so.
Okay,
years.
so within even without warp drive or any of this nonsense, you can basically take over large swaths of the galaxy. And so that's a very strong constraint, right? That clearly hasn't happened to us. We haven't been taken over by some demonic AI. At least we don't. I mean, maybe some very sci-fi ideas, that's true, but we don't think that's happened. And so
the lizard people.
And this is a product of your work, and I know you're an optimist for life in the universe, an intelligent life in the universe. How do you reconcile that hard data point with the fact we're here? And more generally, we're talking about the Fermi Paradox here, of course. Is that even a paradox in your mind?
Yeah. So this was great. I mean, I think what we did was, because this is, this question goes back to, this is the Fermi Paradox question. The Fermi, there's the direct Fermi Paradox, and that's what that over lunch when he blurted out, like, where is everybody? That's what he meant. Why aren't they here now? If technological intelligence, starfaring intelligence is common, why haven't they landed in Paris?
Yeah, he wasn't talking about radio transmissions.
No, right. That's what people have to understand, like that. So that is what we call the direct Fermi Paradox. And then there's the indirect. Why haven't we found anybody why haven't we found any radio messages? And so let's push that one to the side, because we're going to see that that's not even.
It's easy to get out of.
That one's totally easy to get out of. So I didn't find, so the way, I wasn't crushed by this. But we did, just to finish this. So what we showed was, people have been talking about this for a while, we showed that there was really no way out of it, right? That's what we showed. Because people had said, like, oh, maybe the settlement front stalls, or, various things, or like, supernova open up a hole, and then, so what we did found was like, nope, it sweeps over, the whole galaxy is settled very quickly, But here's what we found, right? And that's why I'm not too bothered by it. There's a range of parameters where, so now you don't ask how fast does it sweep across the galaxy, that's going to be fast. But now you have to ask about the steady state. Oh, okay. So now, what's the settlement demographics look like steady state? Because, here's the assumption: civilizations end. I don't think that's a radical, civilizations, the colony on Altair 4 lasted for 100,000 years and then it fell apart for whatever reasons. So if you add that into it, now you've got settlements that are rising and now you've got settlements that are dying. And so now what's the steady state? And what we found is that there's a range of parameters like how frequent are there good planets? Like, say you need a planet with an oxygen atmosphere. How many of those are there? So depending on those parameters, what you can have is regions, you can have bubbles open up that are sparsely populated. And those bubbles don't last forever, but let's say we're in one of those bubbles, and we've been in one of those bubbles for just 3 million years. It turns out, this is this other paper that we did that you know about called the Silurian hypothesis, any evidence for a previous civilization on Earth is wiped out after about 2 million years. There's just so much resurfacing that you're not going to find, buildings, remnants of buildings and other things. So, if let's say the bubble lasted 20 million years, which is not that hard. If you could have had somebody land, set up a colony, be here for 10,000 years, which is a lot longer, than our technological civilization has lasted, and then die or leave, and then all the record's gone. So it's like, when you take the time part of it, that part of the Fermi paradox doesn't bother me as much, because you've actually got a lot of time where they could have come and gone, and we just don't have the evidence.
I totally understand the idea of a transient extant civilization, but then it could be an extinct civilization could still, we know this, we can slash and burn, and we can ruin an area make it inhospitable for a very long time. And you can imagine the kind of mega engineering capabilities of an advanced civilization could be even more extreme. And then, of course, what about the moon? What about there's parts of the solar system which should really persist? Really persist. It seems to me like I find it hard to believe that someone flew across the galaxy, landed here, built buildings, and that was it. And then they didn't have a space program because they didn't do anything on the moon, and then it all washed away, and they didn't mine away all our uranium. It was pretty controlled. It was pretty. Maybe that was the point. They wanted someone else to come after them.
This is research we could do, like how big a civilization would have how big an effect, because as we know, we have a pretty big civilization on Earth right now.
Their footprint was not big enough to prevent
but our
us
footprint
emerging.
Isn't big enough. Like within 1 million.
But we're not spacefaring. Or at least we're not galactic faring.
Right. So, but I think so that would be an interesting research project to do, of like how big a footprint is it, so that after 10 million years, there's still the footprint. And the question about the moon and we haven't looked, right? So that's the interest. So there should be solar. That's the point of solar system SETI, or artifact SETI that they call. We should be looking on the moon, and we should be looking on, and so I know we were just talking about this today. You have a research project, I have a research project. Just ask, how long does something, if I leave a metal box on the moon, how long does it sit there before it gets degraded? So that's why but in general, the Fermi, the direct Fermi paradox I'm not freaked out by it, because I see a way out. I think there's interesting questions to ask that you could do more research on. The indirect Fermi paradox, which is why haven't we found signals from other species or from other stars? And the answer to that is simple: nobody's looked. Right. So Jason Wright et al. Did a study where they looked at all the SETI searches that have ever been done, and it turns because people have this idea that every night astronomers are turning on their telescopes and looking at the sky for extraterrestrial intelligence. And the fact is, there's never been any money to do this. There's
as we heard about at the beginning,
right. So Jason's what they found was if you think of the sky, or the parameter space that you have to search to find signals from a distant alien civilization as the ocean, then so far we've searched through a hot tub worth of water. And so if you searched through a hot tub worth of ocean and didn't find any fish, would you be like, well, that's it, there's no fish in the ocean? So we just haven't looked. So, that's still has to be done.
So just maybe as a final thought then, to conclude all these ideas together, and I'm going to ask you to speculate, but what is your...
I love that. I'm good at
What
that.
is your most probable version of keeping... I assume you want to keep your optimist hat on, of what life looks like in our galaxy? What's going on out there that we're yet to uncover?
So So here's what I'm going to speculate. I think warp drives and those kinds may be hard. I think it's possible. This is one, and this is also a bit of my thinking about even the direct Fermi paradox. It's possible that, getting between the stars is expensive and difficult, and it takes a long time, and it's just hard. And so what does that mean? It means that unless the individuals in a civilization, let's just stick with biology now, are pretty long-lived, then you don't really have galactic civilizations. Because if every message back and forth takes 100 years, right, then how do you even have diplomacy then? So it may be that there's a lot of life in the universe, there's a lot of civilizations, but they're pretty trapped in their local systems. And you can go back and forth between systems, but it's a long time, it's a lot of effort. And so I can imagine that you're not getting these galactic spanning empires, because the distances between the stars is vast, and there is no way to go faster than the speed of light. So
you just can't maintain that monolithic culture.
Right. If the time, if you're still limited by light speed for communication, also like lasers or whatever, that makes a lot more sense to me. That's kind of what it looks like. And so there are other intelligent civilizations. They may get very advanced, but the laws of physics still mean that it takes a long time to get from one space to the other. And so that just sort of limits to a certain extent what can happen.
Which is why I love talking to you. Always give me some sense of optimism in this search that we're on. We're not wasting our time.
We're not wasting our time.
And it's what's so exciting is that we live in an era where this is experimentally testable, and we can actually design experiments and look for this. And thank you for your hard work in the community,
and thank you for
pushing the charge and getting us to a point where we can actually engage in this work and have funding to do so. So thank you, Adam.
Sure, my pleasure.
So that was my conversation with Adam Frank. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I can honestly say that sitting down with Adam is always such a pleasure because he has such an open and expansive view about the possibilities and capabilities of other civilizations out there. And to me, that is both humbling, inspiring, and kind of jaw-dropping, thinking about the capabilities and technologies of other civilizations that could be in our galaxy, cohabiting it with us. On the other hand, maybe there aren't. Maybe we are alone. Perhaps the Earth is the only refuge of life, intelligence, and consciousness in the entire galaxy, maybe even the entire observable universe. These are questions that keep me awake at night. It is an itch that I have to answer, that I feel compelled to devote my professional career to trying to contribute and figure out a little bit of the story about what's really going on out there. I think many of us feel this way. And so it is a awe-inspiring topic to talk about, to think about, and perhaps this mission of trying to answer this question isn't just a personal goal or even a collective goal of many of us, but could even be the goal, the singular purpose of our point of existence on this planet. I sometimes genuinely wonder that, whether our function as a civilization is simply to figure out if there are others out there. And the only way to figure that out, the only way for us to determine the answer to this question is to go out there and look in all of the different ways that we can think of, in all of the different wavelengths of light, all of the different technologies we can think of. And certainly Adam's work is profound in trying to push the envelope of what and how we might look for those other forms of life. So if you enjoyed this conversation, if you enjoy these conversations on this podcast, then please do consider supporting us. You can head to coolworldslab.com/support. That's coolworldslab.com/support. You can become a member, where you can become a donor to not just my research team, the Cool Worlds Lab, but also my outreach work. This includes the Cool Worlds YouTube channel and, of course, also this podcast. So thank you so much for watching. And until next time, I will see you around the galaxy.